Commander HFY stood on the bridge of his massive warship and looked out at the stars that once belonged to humans. 50 years had passed since they vanished without any warning or explanation. The galaxy had celebrated that day like it was the greatest victory in history. No more human ships racing between star systems. No more human colonies spreading across every habitable world. No more humans making deals and breaking ancient rules that had kept the galaxy stable for thousands of years. The Galarian Federation had been quick to claim the industrial worlds that humans left behind. These planets still hummed with massive factories and mining operations that humans had built with their strange ability to make anything work better than it should. HFY remembered the day his people first landed on New Detroit. The automated systems were still running perfectly even though no human had touched them for months. The production lines kept making starship parts and weapons with efficiency that made Galarian engineers weep with envy. Other species had grabbed what they could too. The Vorthan Science Council took over human research stations scattered across the outer rim. These facilities contained laboratories filled with equipment that seemed to bend the laws of physics. The Nexus Collective absorbed the trade routes that humans had established between distant galaxies. They found navigation data and diplomatic contacts that opened up markets no other species even knew existed. Everyone agreed that humans had been the galaxy's biggest problem. They refused to stay in their assigned sector like every civilized species did. Instead, they spread everywhere and got involved in everything. When the Thex Empire went to war with the Unified Worlds over mining rights in the Sigma Quadrant, humans showed up as mediators, even though nobody asked them to come. When plague struck the outer colonies, human medical ships arrived before official rescue fleets even launched. When pirates started raiding the shipping lanes near Vega Station, human patrol ships were hunting them down while the authorities were still filing paperwork. The worst part was how good humans were at everything they tried. Other species had spent millions of years developing their special skills. The Galarians were master engineers who could build anything. The Vorthans were brilliant scientists who understood the deepest secrets of the universe. The Zephyrians were natural diplomats who could negotiate peace between any enemies. But humans could do all of these things and more. They built machines that worked better than Galarian designs. They made scientific discoveries that left Vorthon researchers speechless. They solved conflicts that had lasted for centuries with simple solutions that nobody else had thought of. Captain Lisa Gray had been their last known representative in galactic politics. HFY remembered meeting her during the final peace talks between the Thex Empire and the Unified Worlds. She was smaller than most species in the room, but somehow commanded more attention than anyone else. Her voice was calm when she spoke, but carried an authority that made everyone listen. She had this way of looking at problems from angles that nobody else could see. The peace treaty she negotiated was supposed to end a war that had been raging for 20 standard years. Both sides had agreed to terms that seemed impossible just weeks before. The Thex Empire would keep their ancestral mining worlds, but share the profits with displaced colonists. The Unified Worlds would maintain control of the shipping routes, but allow free passage for Thex merchants. It was the kind of deal that should have taken decades to arrange, but Lisa Gray had worked it out in a few months of careful talks. Her final transmission had been strange and unsettling. She spoke about humanity's next great journey and how they had done everything they could to prepare the galaxy for what was coming. Most leaders thought she was talking about some new expansion into unexplored space. Humans were always looking for new worlds to settle and new challenges to face. But her words carried a weight that suggested something much bigger was happening. Then they were gone. Every human ship in known space simply vanished from sensor networks in the same instant. Human colonies went silent with no distress signals or explanation. Space stations that had been busy with human activity became empty metal shells drifting through the void. It was as if an entire species had been erased from existence in a single moment. The major galactic powers moved quickly to claim what humans had left behind. There were arguments and small conflicts over who got which systems, but nothing like the wars that had torn the galaxy apart before humans arrived. Everyone was too relieved to fight over the details. The age of human interference was over, and civilized species could return to the natural order that had existed for millennia. HFY had been promoted to commander of the occupation fleet stationed in former human space. His job was to make sure the industrial worlds kept producing the materials that the Galarian Federation needed. It should have been simple work, but the human machines were proving difficult to understand. They worked perfectly, but nobody could figure out how to improve them or build new ones using the same principles. At the factories on New Detroit were still running at full capacity, but Kalarian engineers couldn't modify the production lines to make different products. The mining equipment on Kepler-7 could extract resources from asteroids that should have been impossible to reach, but attempts to copy the technology always failed. The defense platforms guarding the major shipping lanes were still operational and responded to authorized commands, but their weapon systems used energy principles that violated known physics. As Zexai watched the stars from his command bridge, he wondered if claiming human territory had been as great a victory as everyone believed. The galaxy was certainly more peaceful without humans stirring up trouble everywhere they went. Trade moved along established routes without unexpected competition. Scientific research proceeded at the careful pace that prevented dangerous discoveries. Diplomatic relations followed protocols that had been refined over thousands of years. But something felt wrong about the silence where human voices used to be. The galaxy seemed smaller somehow, less dynamic and full of possibilities. Zexai pushed these thoughts away and focused on his duty. Humans were gone, and that was good for everyone involved. The galaxy could finally develop according to natural laws without their chaotic influence disrupting the balance that had taken so long to achieve. 20 years had passed since humans disappeared, and the galaxy was starting to crack. Dr. Vexthul of the Vorthan Science Council stood in what used to be Dr. Kelvin Ross's private laboratory on Research Station Alpha 9. The human scientist had left behind thousands of files and experiments that the Vorthan still couldn't fully understand. His work covered everything from quantum mechanics to biological warfare defense, but most of it was written in a way that assumed knowledge the Vorthans didn't have. The universal translators that humans had invented were breaking down across the galaxy. These devices had made communication between different species so easy that most people forgot how difficult it used to be. Before humans came along, diplomatic meetings required teams of linguists and cultural experts just to avoid accidentally starting wars over misunderstood words. Now the translators were failing one by one, and nobody knew how to fix them properly. The Kalarian Federation had tried to reverse engineer the translation technology, but their best scientists couldn't figure out how the devices actually worked. The hardware was simple enough, but the software contained algorithms that seemed to understand meaning rather than just converting words. It was as if the translators could read thoughts and intentions instead of just processing language. Every attempt to build new ones resulted in crude machines that could barely handle basic conversations. Similar problems were appearing everywhere humans had left their mark. The quantum jump drives that made fast travel between star systems possible were starting to malfunction. These engines could fold space and time to cross distances that should take years in just a few days. Human engineers had installed them on ships throughout the galaxy, but now they were failing and nobody could repair them. The few remaining drives were guarded like precious artifacts and rationed only for the most important missions. On the border between Kalarian and Thek's territory, Ambassador Nexhai tried to mediate a growing dispute over mining rights in the Centauri system. Both sides claimed the same asteroid belt, and tensions were rising toward open conflict. In the old days, human diplomats would have arrived to help work out a solution that both species could accept. Their ability to see compromise where others saw only conflict had prevented countless wars. But there were no human mediators coming to help. The peace treaty that Captain Lisa Gray had negotiated was falling apart, as both sides interpreted the terms differently. The Thek's empire claimed that sharing profits meant they could charge fees for mineral extraction. The unified worlds argued that free passage for merchants included the right to establish permanent trading posts. Without human lawyers to explain what the original agreement actually meant, the dispute grew more heated every day. The criminal organizations that humans had spent decades hunting down were growing bold again. The Red Nova Syndicate had taken control of 3 major shipping routes and was demanding tribute from merchant vessels. Their leader, a Zephyrian named Kexval, boasted that human law enforcement had been the only thing keeping his people from claiming their rightful place as rulers of the space lanes. Human police forces had worked differently than anyone expected. Instead of just patrolling their own territory, they shared information across species boundaries and coordinated joint operations that could track criminals anywhere in the galaxy. Their databases contained files on smugglers, pirates, and corrupt officials from dozens of different worlds. Without access to this information network, local security forces were nearly blind to threats that crossed system boundaries. On the outer rim of known space, long-range sensors had detected something moving in the dark between galaxies. The signals were faint and distorted, but suggested objects of enormous size approaching from the void. Dr. Kelvin. Ross's research notes contained detailed analysis of extragalactic threats and defensive strategies, but his warnings had been ignored by the major powers. Most scientists had assumed he was being paranoid about imaginary dangers. Now those files seemed prophetic. Ross had written about entities that fed on the life energy of entire civilizations. He described them as forces of pure entropy that consumed everything in their path and left only dead space behind. His defensive theories included plans for galaxy-wide shield networks and coordinated military responses that would require unprecedented cooperation between all known species. The problem was that Ross's plans assumed the galaxy would work together like humans naturally did. He had designed strategies that required constant communication, shared resources, and unified command structures. These concepts made sense to humans who saw the galaxy as one big community with common interests. But other species thought in terms of territory and competition. They had spent millions of years fighting over resources and establishing dominance through strength. Hidden deep in an abandoned human space station, an artificial intelligence called Oracle had been broadcasting warning messages for months. The AI claimed to have been built by Ambassador Jake Mitchell before humans disappeared. Its transmissions described the approaching threat and urged the galactic powers to prepare their defenses. But most leaders dismissed the warnings as glitches in old human computer systems. The few scientists who took Oracle seriously couldn't understand its technical specifications for improved weapons and shield systems. The AI's knowledge came from human research that had been years ahead of what other species could achieve. Its suggestions required manufacturing techniques and energy sources that seemed impossible to develop. Even worse, Oracle insisted that effective defense would require the kind of unity and cooperation that had died with human civilization. Trade was collapsing as the economic systems humans had established began to fail. Human merchants had created a complex network of partnerships that connected distant markets and balanced supply with demand across the galaxy. They had somehow made it profitable for ice miners from frozen worlds to sell their products to desert planets thousands of light years away. Without human coordination, these trade relationships were breaking down into isolated local markets. The Nexus Collective controlled most of the former human trade routes, but they couldn't maintain the relationships that made those routes valuable. Human traders had spent generations building trust with alien customers and learning their cultural preferences. They knew which species preferred quality over quantity, and which ones valued speed over cost. This knowledge had been passed down through human families and trading companies that no longer existed. Dr. Vexthal closed Dr. Ross's files and walked to the observation deck of Research Station Alpha 9. The stars looked the same as they always had, but something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. The dynamic energy that humans had brought to everything they touched was gone. Progress had slowed to the careful pace that species preferred, when they didn't have humans pushing them to think bigger and move faster. But the approaching signals from beyond the galaxy suggested that careful progress might not be enough anymore. Whatever was coming from the dark between the stars had prompted humans to spend decades preparing defenses. They had tried to strengthen the galaxy for a war that other species couldn't even imagine. Now those species would have to face the threat, alone with technology they didn't understand and unity they had never learned to achieve. The galaxy had celebrated when humans disappeared, but celebration was turning to quiet desperation as the consequences became clear. Humans hadn't just been another species among many. They had been the glue holding everything together, the force that pushed civilization forward, and the guardian that prepared for dangers others couldn't see. Without them, the galaxy was learning what it meant to be truly alone in a universe full of things that wanted to consume it. The darkness between galaxies had given birth to something terrible, and it was coming. Fleet Admiral Kexthar of the Combined Galactic Defense Force watched the sensor readings with growing horror as massive objects emerged from the void between star systems. The entities called themselves the Devourers, and they moved through space like a plague of living shadow that consumed everything in their path. Their ships were impossible to understand. The hulls seemed to be made of crystallized nothingness that absorbed light and energy without reflecting anything back. When the first scout vessels tried to scan them, the Devourer ships simply ate the sensor beams and grew slightly larger. Conventional weapons passed through their hulls like they were firing at empty space. Energy shields that should have protected galactic vessels instead fed power directly to the Devourer engines. The Outer Rim colonies had been the first to die. Epsilon Station had sent a standard greeting message to the approaching fleet, but received only silence in return. Then the Devourer ships had surrounded the space station and begun feeding. The metal and energy that made up the station flowed into their hulls like water being absorbed by hungry Earth. Within hours, nothing remained except empty space where a thriving community had existed for centuries. Captain Ben Carter's final mission logs had been discovered in an abandoned Earth facility near the Sol system. The human officer had been tracking extragalactic threats for decades before humans disappeared. His files contained detailed analysis of Devourer technology and behavior patterns that proved humans had known this attack was coming. Every human innovation and military advancement had been designed with these enemies in mind. The quantum jump drives that humans had spread throughout the galaxy weren't just for faster travel. They were designed to create unpredictable movement patterns that made it difficult for Devourers to track and intercept ships. The universal translators contained hidden subroutines that could detect Devourer communication frequencies and warn nearby vessels of approaching attacks. Even the trade routes that humans had established followed paths that avoided the regions where Devourers were most likely to emerge from deep space. Dr. Kelvin Ross's research had been focused entirely on defense against entities that fed on life energy and technological advancement. His notes described the Devourers as a force of pure entropy that had consumed dozens of galaxies across the universe. They moved in cycles that lasted millions of years, completely destroying one region of space before moving on to find new sources of energy to consume. The Devourers had a simple but terrifying strategy. They would approach a galaxy and study its inhabitants from a distance, learning about their technology and social structures. Then they would attack the most advanced civilizations first, absorbing their knowledge and capabilities before moving on to weaker targets. The process continued until nothing remained except dead worlds and empty space. What made them truly dangerous was their ability to adapt to any defense. When the Calarian Federation launched a massive missile barrage, the Devourer ships simply opened portals that swallowed the weapons and converted their explosive energy into fuel. When the Vorthon Science Council tried to disrupt their ships with quantum interference, the Devourers learned to use the interference as a navigation system that made them even more efficient at finding targets. The worst discovery came when Admiral Kexthar realized that standard military tactics actually helped the enemy. Every time galactic forces gathered their fleets for a coordinated attack, they created exactly the kind of concentrated energy source that Devourers were designed to consume. The massive ships and powerful weapons that the galaxy's civilizations were so proud of became feeding stations that made the enemy stronger. Fleet Admiral Nora Blake's tactical files had been found in a sealed bunker beneath the ruins of New Washington. The human commander had spent her entire career developing strategies to fight enemies that could adapt to conventional warfare. Her plans required the kind of unity and improvisation that humans excelled at, but other species found nearly impossible to achieve. Blake's strategies assumed that effective defense would require constant innovation and unpredictable tactics. She had designed battle plans that changed every few hours to prevent enemies from adapting to them. Her supply chains were deliberately chaotic to make it impossible for attackers to predict where resources would be located. Most importantly, her command structure encouraged individual initiative rather than following rigid protocols. The problem was that these tactics went against everything that galactic military doctrine taught. The Calarian Federation had spent thousands of years perfecting formations and procedures that maximized efficiency and minimized confusion. The Thex Empire believed in overwhelming force applied according to time-tested strategies. The unified worlds preferred defensive positions that could be held indefinitely with minimum casualties, Commander. Zexhai led the defense of the Kepler system but found himself fighting an enemy that made no sense. The Devourer ships would approach his battle formations and then simply disappear when his weapons fired at them. They reappeared behind his lines and began consuming his ships from the inside out. When he tried to retreat, they followed and fed on the energy from his engines. When he stopped to fight, they surrounded him and absorbed the power from his shields. The artificial intelligence Oracle had been broadcasting increasingly desperate warnings as the Devourer fleet moved deeper into galactic space. The AI claimed to understand human defensive strategies, but needed cooperation between species that had never worked together effectively. Its tactical suggestions required sharing technology and resources in ways that violated every territorial agreement in galactic law. Most tragic was the discovery that humans had tried to prepare the galaxy for this exact threat. Every diplomatic mission they had undertaken was designed to build the trust and cooperation that would be needed to fight the Devourers. Every technological innovation they had shared was meant to give other species the tools they would need to survive. Every peace treaty they had negotiated was intended to prevent the internal conflicts that would weaken galactic defenses. But the other species had resented human interference and rejected their leadership. They had seen human success as a threat to their own dominance, rather than preparation for a greater danger. When humans tried to establish unified command structures, other species had accused them of seeking galactic conquest. When humans shared advanced weapons technology, they were blamed for disrupting the balance of power. The Vorthon Science Council had finally decoded some of Dr. Ross's most advanced research and made a horrifying discovery. The Devourers weren't just consuming the galaxy for food or resources. They were preparing it for something much worse that was coming behind them from the deep void between universes. The current attack was just the beginning of a process that would ultimately tear apart the fabric of space and time itself. As system after system fell to the Devourer advance, the surviving galactic powers finally understood what humans had been trying to tell them. The galaxy wasn't just a collection of competing civilizations fighting over territory and resources. It was a single living community that needed to work together to survive threats that no individual species could face alone. But that understanding came too late. The Devourers had consumed too much of the galaxy's industrial capacity and too many of its most advanced worlds. The remaining civilizations huddled in fortified core systems and watched helplessly as the entropy wave swept toward them. Without human innovation, human diplomacy, and human leadership, they had no idea how to fight an enemy that grew stronger every time they attacked it. The galaxy had celebrated when humans disappeared, but now it faced the consequences of that celebration. Humans had been the galaxy's immune system, the force that prepared for dangers and built the unity needed to face them. Without humans, the galaxy finally knew fear in its purest form as an endless darkness approach that would consume everything and leave only silence behind. The galaxy was dying, and its survivors were desperate enough to do something they had never done before. Dr. Vexthul worked alongside Calarian engineers and Thek scientists in Colonel Amy Foster's abandoned laboratory, trying to understand her research into dimensional physics. For the first time in galactic history, species that had been enemies for millennia were cooperating because they had no other choice. Foster's theories had seemed impossible when humans first proposed them decades ago. She claimed that space and time could be folded to create pocket dimensions where different physical laws applied. Most scientists had dismissed her work as fantasy, but now her equations were the only hope of finding where humans had gone. The mathematical proofs were elegant but required computational power that no single species possessed. The Vorthon Science Council contributed their quantum processors while the Calarian Federation provided manufacturing expertise to build the dimensional resonance equipment. The Thex Empire offered their energy generation technology, and the Nexus Collective shared their navigation databases. It was the kind of cooperation that humans had been trying to encourage for generations, but it had taken the threat of total extinction to make it happen. Oracle had finally been taken seriously as the only remaining source of human knowledge. The artificial intelligence revealed that humans hadn't disappeared at all. They had retreated to a parallel dimension, where time moved differently and physical laws could be manipulated. The AI claimed that humans had been preparing for the Devourer invasion for 50 accelerated years, developing weapons and strategies that would be impossible in normal space. The first attempt to contact the human dimension failed catastrophically. The dimensional rift generator exploded and killed half the research team when they tried to force a connection using conventional physics. Oracle explained that the barrier between dimensions wasn't meant to be broken by outside force. It could only be opened from the inside or through a harmonic resonance that matched human brainwave patterns. That discovery led to the most desperate search in galactic history. The surviving species combed through every abandoned human facility looking for any biological traces that could be used to create the resonance pattern. Dr. Vex Thule found preserved tissue samples in a medical research station near Alpha Centauri. The samples were degraded but contained enough genetic information to reconstruct human neural pathways. Building a synthetic human brain was the most complex project the galaxy had ever attempted. It required combining Vorthon biological expertise with Calarian engineering precision and Thex energy manipulation techniques. The artificial brain had to be complex enough to generate genuine human thought patterns but stable enough to survive the dimensional contact process. The project took 3 months while the Devourers continued consuming outer galaxy systems. Entire sectors went dark as the entropy wave swept through them, leaving only empty space where thriving civilizations had existed for thousands of years. The core worlds were running out of time as the enemy fleet approached the heavily populated inner systems. When the synthetic brain finally activated, it immediately began generating the harmonic frequencies that Oracle had been waiting for. The dimensional barrier started to resonate and crack as reality bent around the contact point. For the first time in 70 years, a human voice spoke to the galaxy, but it wasn't the voice that anyone expected to hear. Commander Rick Stone responded to their desperate calls with words that chilled every listener. His voice carried the weight of decades spent preparing for a war that would determine the fate of everything they knew. When asked why humans had abandoned the galaxy, he gave a simple answer that explained everything. The galaxy hadn't been ready to fight beside them, and humans had hoped other species would learn to work together without human guidance. But the galaxy had failed that test. Instead of building unity, the major powers had fought over human territory and technology. Instead of preparing for greater threats, they had returned to the old patterns of competition and conflict. The cooperation that was finally happening now should have been developed decades ago, when there was still time to build proper defenses. The contact lasted only minutes before the dimensional rift collapsed. Commander Stone's final words were both promise and warning. Humans would return when they were ready, but the galaxy would have to survive on its own until then. The survivors were left to face the approaching Devourers with inadequate defenses and incomplete understanding of what they were fighting. The next few weeks brought disasters that pushed galactic civilization to the edge of total collapse. The Devourer main fleet arrived in the inner systems and began the final phase of their assault. Their massive ships surrounded entire worlds and consumed them whole, absorbing the life energy of billions of inhabitants in minutes. The industrial capacity that had taken millennia to build was destroyed in days. Commander Zexai led the last desperate defense of the Calarian home system, but his ships were no match for enemies that grew stronger with every attack. The Devourer vessels had evolved beyond their original forms and now resembled living creatures made of crystallized darkness. They moved through space like predators hunting prey, seeking out sources of energy and technology to consume. The most horrifying moment came when the Devourers reached Earth itself. The abandoned human homeworld should have been an empty target, but long-range sensors detected massive energy signatures hidden beneath the planet's surface. When the Devourer ships descended to investigate, they triggered defense systems that had been waiting for 70 years. The automated defenses were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human technology that combined dimensional manipulation with pure creative force erupted from hidden installations across the Earth. The Devourer ships found themselves trapped in spatial anomalies that turned their own entropy against them. For the first time since the invasion began, the enemies were forced to retreat from a target they couldn't consume. But the victory was temporary. The automated systems shut down after repelling the attack, apparently programmed to activate only once. The Devourers learned from the encounter and began developing countermeasures for the dimensional weapons they had faced. Earth's defenses had bought time but not salvation. Dr. Vex Thule realized that the human defense of Earth had been a message as much as a military action. Humans had left behind a demonstration of what they were capable of when they chose to fight rather than flee. The technology they had used was decades ahead of anything the Devourers had encountered in their conquest of other galaxies. It suggested that humans had spent their time in exile becoming something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. The artificial intelligence. Oracle began broadcasting new messages that filled the survivors with both hope and terror. The AI claimed that human preparations were nearly complete, and their return was imminent. But it also warned that the humans who came back would be different from the ones who had left. 70 years of preparation for total war had changed them into something the galaxy had never seen before. As the Devourer fleet prepared for their final assault on the galactic core, reality itself began to shiver and crack around the dimensional barriers. The survivors could feel something massive approaching from beyond normal space and time. The humans were coming home, but they were bringing weapons and technologies that would reshape the fundamental nature of the universe. The galaxy had learned to fear the Devourers and their hunger for destruction. But now it was about to discover what the Devourers themselves feared when they encountered a species that had spent decades learning how to turn the very concept of fear into a weapon. Humans were returning, and they had become something that made even entities of pure entropy hesitate before attacking. The final battle for the galaxy was about to begin, and it would determine whether the universe would be consumed by darkness or protected by a species that had chosen to become its guardian, regardless of whether anyone else wanted their protection. Reality tore open like fabric being ripped apart by invisible hands, and humanity returned to a galaxy that barely recognized them. The dimensional barriers shattered in a cascade of light and energy that could be seen from thousands of light years away. What emerged from the rift between worlds was not the species that had left 70 years ago, but something that had evolved far beyond what anyone thought possible. Admiral Kate Hughes stood on the command deck of her flagship and surveyed the devastation that the Devourers had brought to her home galaxy. Her ship was more fortress than vessel, constructed from materials that bent space and time around them. The hull seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, but remained harder than any substance known to galactic science. Energy patterns danced across its surface in ways that hurt to look at directly. The human fleet that followed her through the dimensional gateway defied every law of physics that the galaxy understood. Their ships moved without engines by manipulating the fundamental forces that held reality together. They communicated without transmitters by linking their consciousness directly to the fabric of space itself. Most terrifying of all, they radiated an energy signature that made the Devourers recoil for the first time in their existence. When Admiral Hughes opened communications with the surviving galactic powers, her words carried the weight of decades spent preparing for this moment. She spoke calmly, but every syllable contained the promise of violence beyond imagination. The galaxy had been given time to unite and had chosen instead to scatter into competing factions. Now humans would demonstrate why the Devourers had learned to fear them, across multiple dimensions. The first engagement, between human and Devourer forces, lasted only minutes but changed the nature of warfare forever. Captain Steve Turner led a boarding party directly through the hull of a Devourer ship, using technology that allowed them to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Devourers had never faced enemies who could attack them from inside their own vessels using passages that didn't exist in normal space. Lieutenant Helen Price piloted fighters that folded space around them to appear in multiple locations at once. Her weapons fired projectiles made of crystallized time that aged Devourer ships into dust before they could react. The enemy vessels that had seemed invincible against conventional weapons crumbled when faced with attacks that struck them across past, present, and future simultaneously. Engineer Dan Cooper deployed defensive systems that turned the Devourer's own entropy against them. His devices created zones of reversed causality, where destruction became creation and consumption became generation. Devourer ships that entered these fields found themselves rebuilding the very targets they were trying to destroy, trapped in loops of frustrated hunger that drove them to self-destruction. But the most terrifying moment came when a group of Devourer vessels attempted to flee toward the galactic rim. They had never retreated from any enemy in their millions of years of existence, but something about human warfare broke their fundamental programming. Admiral Hughes allowed them to run for several light years before demonstrating why escape was impossible. The fleeing Devourer ships suddenly found themselves surrounded by human vessels that had somehow arrived ahead of them. Hughes had used dimensional manipulation to place her fleet at the Devourer's destination before they had even decided to flee there. The enemy ships realized they were facing opponents who could predict and counter their actions before they made them. The human strategy wasn't just about superior technology or dimensional manipulation. They fought with a creativity and adaptability that the Devourers couldn't comprehend. Every attack was different from the last. Every defense used principles that the enemy had never encountered. Humans seemed to invent new ways of fighting in real time, as if the entire concept of warfare was just another puzzle for them to solve. Commander Rick Stone broadcast a message to the retreating Devourer main fleet that became legendary across multiple galaxies. He explained that the Devourers had made a fundamental error in their understanding of humanity. They had assumed that humans were just another species to be consumed, but humans had never been limited by the normal rules that governed other life forms. The Devourers had spent millions of years perfecting their ability to consume and destroy, but humans had spent 70 accelerated years learning how to create and protect. They had developed weapons that could rebuild destroyed worlds in minutes, and defensive systems that made entire star systems impossible to approach. Most importantly, they had learned to turn their own protective instincts into weapons that could terrify entities that had never known fear. The final battle took place in the space between galaxies where the Devourer command ships had been hiding. These massive vessels were the size of small moons and contained the collective consciousness of their entire species. Admiral Hughes led the human fleet into the void where no normal ship could survive and engaged enemies that existed partially outside reality itself. The combat was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the known universe. Human ships phased in and out of existence while firing weapons that rewrote the laws of physics around their targets. Devourer vessels tried to consume the attacks but found themselves being consumed instead by energies that fed on entropy itself. The very concept of destruction was turned against them by opponents who had learned to weaponize creation. When the last Devourer command ship finally surrendered, its alien consciousness spoke directly to Admiral Hughes through dimensions that normal minds couldn't perceive. It asked how humans had become something that entities of pure entropy could fear. Hughes answered with words that explained everything about what humanity had become during their exile. Humans had never been just another species competing for resources and territory. They were gardeners of reality itself, protectors who shaped the universe around them to nurture life and possibility. The Devourers represented ultimate destruction, but humans had become ultimate creation, forces that could build faster than anything could destroy. The surrender broadcast that Admiral Hughes sent to the fleeing Devourer remnants became the most important transmission in galactic history. She told them that they had consumed 1,000 galaxies but had never faced humans before. They didn't just adapt to survive like other species, but adapted to win in ways that redefined what victory meant. The message ended with a warning that would echo across the universe for millennia. She told the Devourers to run back to the void between realities and spread the word to any other entities that might threaten inhabited space. This galaxy was under human protection now, and humans had become something that made even cosmic forces of destruction prefer to flee rather than fight. They had learned to turn fear itself into a weapon, and they were prepared to use it against anything that threatened the life they had chosen to guard. The galaxy that humans returned to was smaller and scarred, but still alive thanks to their intervention. The other species finally understood what the title of their story meant. For millions of years, the galaxy had known the fear of natural disasters, plague, war, and death, but it had never known the fear of a protective force so powerful that even entities of pure destruction would rather flee than face them. Humans had given the galaxy a chance to stand together as equals, and it had failed that test. Now they had returned as guardians, whether other species wanted their protection or not. The price of that protection was accepting that they shared their galaxy with beings who had learned to make the very concept of fear afraid of them. Human ships now patrolled the spaces between galaxies, eternal sentinels watching for threats that might emerge from the cosmic dark. They had become something beyond what any species thought possible, protectors who could defend reality itself against forces that existed to destroy it. The universe had learned what the Devourers discovered too late, that without humanity the galaxy finally knew fear. But with humanity's return, even the darkness itself learned to be afraid.